One.
Thank you, Shane.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. We're here for the session of the Milton Zoning Board of Appeals, who are in the process of hearing testimony and evidence concerning the application, 40B application involving 648 Canton Avenue in Milton. This evening, my understanding is that we were going to hear from the third and final, I believe, peer review expert engaged by the town on behalf of the board, and that is Mr. Beamer. Do I have that right? Beamer?
Bomer. That's
Bomer,
close
I'm
enough.
sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
No, it's not close enough. Mr. Bomer, I'm sorry. I apologize. So the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. I think where I'll start is just a teeny introduction, and then probably just jump to the end, because I'm sure you don't want me to just recite the document. I trust you all got my report, which was from March 23rd.
Sure. But I would add, however, that there's many members of the public that are involved in this hearing tonight who are listening, who either may not have had access to it or may have not had the opportunity to read it, even if they had access. And so,
Yep.
I think, from my perspective, it's more important that they hear really what you have to say than we do. Because yes, I've read your report. I have a pretty good sense of what you have to say, but there's many out there who have tuned in tonight who I think would like to hear it, if you can.
Terrific. Well, maybe I'll start by just describing my methodology. I think it's important that everybody be very aware that these are very schematic drawings, and I think sometimes it's easy to think that because there's a rendering that is evocative and looks like a building, and it's accompanied by more technical drawings, that one might think that the project is more advanced than it actually is. But from a designer's perspective, these are very schematic drawings. And as such, the focus of my report at this point really isn't, similarly, is not in great depth as far as, are the floor plans working? Is the living room big enough? Can you furnish that room? It's nothing at all like that. It's at this stage of a project, I really look for, is the site strategy, does it make sense? Does the site strategy make sense? Does the scale of the building make sense? Is it adequately respectful or supportive of neighboring buildings and existing development? Is it a positive contribution to the community? Much bigger kinds of issues. And that's where I am at in this project. I do have limited number of comments about the actual architecture, shall we say, or the style of the building, things like that. But again, what I'm looking for is, are they starting in the right place? Is it a good foundation for really beginning a design exploration that will find the right building for that site? So I just wanted to say that in advance, because I think it's way too early in the process to talk about details. Having said that, I'll jump to kind of the conclusion and back into how I got there, I guess. So the conclusion, I thought what was interesting is I did read your civil engineer's report on the project. And I thought that our two reports, after I wrote my report, they're kind of tandem. I think they support each other in a concern about the intensity of use of the site. And they're from a different perspectives, but I think they're both supportable. I overheard you talking a little bit about doing additional test pits, and certainly reading the engineer's concern about working within the water table, stormwater management, really kind of basic engineering issues are being questioned. And the reason that that's the case with this development is it's the scale of the development. I know that I think he said it maybe directly, or it certainly inferred it, the engineer did, that not having slack space, if you're really taking up that much of the site, and then, with just the building and then paving a ring around it that takes up even more of the site and clearing even more of the site to accommodate stormwater management structures, you've pretty much used it up. And there's really no room for error at all. And that was kind of parallel. His conclusions were parallel to my conclusions. Again, from a different perspective. For me, a successful development, in particular a 40B development that we know is almost always of a different scale. One of the primary challenges is, will this development ever be integrated into the community? How do we ensure through the architecture of the building and the site strategy that this will be welcomed in the community, not something that stands out as an anomaly or a place that people don't want to live, or a place that people don't want to visit, or a place that doesn't respect the history or other resources that are on board in the community. And I think where I landed on that front was the strategies that architects use for helping to integrate a bigger building, and it's almost always about being bigger. The strategies the kind of mitigation strategies that are typically used, some of them were employed on the building that sits atop the parking garage. There was some of that was happening that had to do with lowering the elevations of the buildings in some limited areas of the building. So there was some recognition of the kinds of strategies that people use, architects use, to integrate projects into the community. The problem that I had with this, after a lot of study of it, is I don't think that this development will ever fit into the community. And there are many new developments that take a pretty aggressive approach to making the project. They often involve significant clearing of trees, change of grade, removal of ledge, lots of other changes that have to be made to build a building. I think the issue with this development is that there is so little space available to ensure any kind of bigger kind of project scale integration into the community. It's just not there. The footprint of the parking garage is on the order of 70,000 square feet. And it's huge. It's 350 feet by 220 feet. And the front of it, before you get up to the residential level, is 12 feet off of the ground. And I think the kind of the kind of crossover to the civil drawings is that a kind of irony that a project of this scale on a site that is as nice as this site, and a lot of my report talks about how walkable it is, whether you're talking about walking around existing smaller scale residential neighborhoods or accessing active open space at the high school, or walking to the historic town center, going to the library, the town hall, all of that is within walking distance of this site, and there are walkways on both sides of Canton Avenue. And the kind of tell is that with this massive structure, there's a 4-foot wide sidewalk that connects down to the sidewalk on Canton Avenue. And yet, at the same time, there is a massive parking structure to serve cars that would be coming to the site. So I think the words I used in my letter was that it's incongruous. I think that you cannot make the argument on this site that there's a consistent development pattern. You know, if you draw a half-mile circle around this site, there's all sorts of stuff going on. There are small-scale gridded neighborhoods, very walkable, also walkable streets with bigger homes, bigger lots. As I've already pointed out, there's the town center, the high school, there's a hospital within walkable range. There's even another multifamily development. I think it's an elderly development that takes up quite a large amount of space. And all of that is easily accessible and reasonably welcoming. Actually, I think most of those sites are, but the problem with this development is that it really has no fit. I think the way that this project could fit in, to have enough space around it, to get back to that notion of slack, that I think the way that this project could ultimately fit into the neighborhood is if the other nearby homes weren't there, so that it had a site that was really adequate for this scale of development. And I think, again, that's where the connection happens with the civil. I think the civil is saying the same thing, that there just isn't enough space to accommodate all of in his case, the technical needs of the site, and in my case, the needs to integrate the development successfully into the community. So the kind of going back to how I think it could work, because I do think it's a site that could very well accommodate a 40B development for all of the reasons I've said, is that it would be so easy to make a development in this location that would be very welcoming for visitors, and also feel very welcoming for the residents of the building to be part of the community. Would have a very good chance of integrating them into the community. But it would have to be much smaller. I made one suggestion in my report about reducing the size of the plinth that it sits on. Again, it's basically a very large parking garage with a building on top. I think, and there are many advantages to having internal parking, but this is a development that I think actually would benefit if some of the parking were outside of a structure, in areas or landscape parking areas. And I guess I'd give a counter example, or another way that a large development has, I think, more successfully integrated into certainly into the topography. It is that large elderly site that I think is to the northeast of the development. It's small scale buildings, which it wouldn't necessarily have to be, but that site is spread out over a much broader area with roadways that kind of follow the contours, buildings that are built in to the contours, so, and lots of landscaping all around it. And I think even though that's area-wise a much larger development, it certainly is more welcoming and seems to be a much better fit. So I think those are kind of my main points. That I think it's a tough site because of I think it is a site where a parking structure can work. What I said in my report was that it would be awfully nice if the parking were all restricted to being underneath the footprint of the building. That is usually a nice way to ensure that you'll have lots of space on the outdoors outside of the building footprint that can be programmed. Because of the scale of the parking area and then the ring road that goes all the way around it, there's virtually no space left for any kind of other development for use of the residents or visitors of the site. So I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record, but in my opinion, it's really not specifically about the heights of the building. I don't have a lot to say about the architecture of the building at this stage, but I think if there were enough slack space, if it were possible to leave many of the specimen trees in place, I think there are ways that a larger development, not this large, but a larger development could be integrated into the topography and satisfy all the civil engineering concerns, and also be a much more pleasant place for the residents to live, and certainly one, as I said, that could get by this issue of the kind of incongruous nature of this building that I really don't see what can happen now in the initial design of it or in the future of how to better fit it into the surrounding context. I pointed out, and it's pretty obvious, that there are a number of very close by neighbors who are going to really be seriously impacted, visually impacted, as well as all of the other ongoing impacts of there being a lot of people living there who didn't used to live there. And I just don't see any ways to work with the proposed scale of the parking garage and the building on top to really significantly change the experience of this for the neighbors. As is always the case, I don't really talk about traffic. It's not my thing. I know there are concerns of some potential concerns about emergency vehicles, a very big parking structure. What happens when something bad happens inside of that structure? What kind of emergency vehicles can get there? Those are for others to talk about. But my issues really are, I think that a much better job can be done to make a larger building that fits in significantly better than this one does. So I can stop there. I think most of the parts of my report keep coming back to that problem, is I can't figure out how to fix it, other than carving off some really significant pieces of the project.
Well, our practice has been with others who have come to testify before the board is to open it up for questions to both to some of the folks whose faces you see and to members of the public who might have specific questions. And our hope is that we'll sort of limit those questions to your area and more or less to the matters that you've talked about and set out in your report. So with that slight preface, I'll open it up to questions from those who I can see and those who I can't.
Mr. Chair, perhaps I can start. Ned Corcoran.
I would be pleased to have you do so, Mr. Corcoran.
Thank you. And I'm hoping that my internet holds. Mr. Bomer, thank you. And I think it's telling that you really focused on not just the issues as you saw them, but also the issues raised by Mr. Reardon on his civil and stormwater report, it strikes me that good development really starts with the land and the context of that land around it, and that good development ought to focus on what can be built within that context. It seems like in this case, that's not the case, that they really sort of designed a building that tried to get at a unit count and then asked the engineers to sort of plop it into the ground, and didn't give it much room for anything left. Is that a fair and accurate description of what's happened?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I might say a little bit differently. I think this building was not. This building wasn't designed with this site in mind. I think that's what I would say. I think the driver, if I had to read the tea leaves of what's behind this, because of course I don't know the story, what was really driving the design, but to me it represents a strong feeling about having protected parking spaces and a parking ratio of 1.5 and being extremely vehicular oriented, which again was what really struck me, that in such a wonderful walkable environment, to put a building that is so driven, and no pun intended, by vehicular access and a 4-foot wide sidewalk where two baby carriages can't even cross each other to get to access all the pedestrian amenities. So to the degree that I agree, this was not a building that was designed for this site, and it's certainly not taking advantage of where it is.
You might, I know you cite Mr. Reardon's report. Did you see Mr. Dirk's report regarding traffic?
I did, but
He actually recommends more parking, not less parking, because I think there's a pretty good consensus that it may be walkable to the town hall and to the library, but it's not walkable to shopping districts. It's not walkable to transit. It's not walkable to anywhere people can work. It's really a car-centric location, and therefore it needs the parking. And parking means you need a lot of impervious surface, which is difficult to develop. Wouldn't it be appropriate to have started with a design that achieved the stormwater management requirements, for particularly with a building that sits next to a wetland?
Well, one would think if a civil engineer was first on board, that would be pretty important for them. But I do want to repeat that at the same time that some may recommend larger parking ratio, I think the planning department in Milton, I think, thought a lower parking ratio might work too. But again, it's not my thing at all. If, in my opinion, right now there are too many parking spaces on the site. So whether that means you need to have fewer units or whatever that means, it's kind of hard to imagine how to fit more parking than what's already there.
No, I think I would agree. I think there's too much of everything here relative to the scale of the site, relative to the water impacts, relative to impact on surrounding areas and the like.
Well, that's why I use the term intensity of use. I think there's like nothing left to use on that site. It's 100% used up.
I think there's been some suggestion, at least from the developer side, that the articulation of the building, if you will, on the plinth was designed to sort of set height back away from different neighbors, particularly on Holmes Lane. But the northwest corner of the building, which is a full 4 stories and sits on top of the full height of the plinth, 12 feet, is actually 57 feet above the closest residence. Didn't do much to mitigate the impact of the height on that residence. Meanwhile, about 150 feet to the south, they carve out an area that is sort of open lawn area on the plinth, and that overlooks the wetland and the woods. The articulation of the building doesn't really seem to me to pay attention to the visual impacts and the scale impacts on the residential homes around it.
Well, particularly because I think the difficulty, I'm only going to say this is I don't think this is the solution, but that issue is exacerbated by the fact that so much clearing has to happen. And the way that it's kind of what I said at the beginning about how you can integrate you can take an aggressive development strategy as long as time can heal it, I think. And we all know, we walk into developments with 4-inch trees held up by strings, and 20 years later, they're beautifully integrated into the community. And I think that is, again, my issue with this. The articulation of the building, I think that was largely done, again, if I'm going to read into the tea leaves, the funny thing about articulating the building like that, while it helps to break up in the strictest sense, the linearity of it, it's still sitting on a plinth that's 350 feet long. And by creating so much surface area by the number of changes of direction in the footprint, you actually see it can also really create a sense of monumentality that makes it seem even more foreign. So in some respects, there may be fewer long unbroken stretches of, in this case, clapboards. So maybe that can help with the scale, but at the same time, it has a kind, and particularly with this language, it has a kind of palatial kind of look to it that always has an associations of scale and monumentality.
It's interesting to note, you indicated the size of the plinth, 350 feet by 220 feet. That's larger than the Milton High School football field.
I'm not a sports guy either, sorry.
Football field is 300 feet long.
All right, okay.
And is less than 220 feet wide.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I may, could I ask a question of Mr. Bomer and perhaps bring the hearing back towards the direction of asking questions and
Sure, that'd be fine.
Less in the way of statements.
Go ahead, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Could I ask Mr. Bomer if he would indulge us to give a little bit more in the way of detail and elaboration in terms of your comments regarding visual and other impacts in the closing paragraphs of your letter? I didn't really understand what that meant, other than that neighbors could see the building, because you also noted that there wasn't a photometric plan or a shadow study, which are coming. But if you could just elaborate on what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, I think the quickest way to get to understand the impact, particularly is related to the scale of it, that would help me and everyone else understand it. I think I did request that a 3D model be made available that really puts the massing of the building in the context, because all we have is our imagination from the materials that were provided to me for review. The only real three-dimensional images are very selective perspective views. So I think basically what I was saying about where the materials are at this point is, I think everyone will have a better grip on the visual impact of the building if we can actually look at it in context and see how it will actually be perceived. So I have an image in my mind, and it's it's based on understanding that most of the site will have to be cleared in order to build this and to create the stormwater management areas. But I think, understanding that even to get to the base of the plinth, there's 16 feet of grade change. And I think that it's very difficult for the public to understand what that will look like. And it's hard for anybody who doesn't do this regularly to really be able to visualize how something like this will actually look. So I don't know if I answer your question or not, but yes, the neighbors will be able to see it, but we don't know exactly what they'll see because we don't really have enough materials to be able to figure that out.
Well, I guess, Mr. Bomer, what I was getting at in a sense was, what is it about the neighbors seeing the building is a per se a negative aspect? Are you concerned about light impacts? Are you concerned about noise impacts? Because just the fact that someone can see a building from our perspective is not in and of itself a negative aspect.
I completely agree with that. No, I totally agree with that. And as a fact, there is, and in fact, I think one of my larger ongoing criticisms of approaches to landscaping is building big buildings and then planting the largest possible wall around it so nobody can see it. And that's what I was talking about earlier. What I don't see is possible in this, because of the scale of this development, is a way to make a reasonable tie-in to the neighborhood. You're totally right. I don't have any issues with believing that anything that is different from the way it was or that can be seen is inherently bad. I'm just having troubles really understanding how this could be, as I say, integrated into the community. So it's beyond just visual impact. It's kind of the whole package of scale. There are lots of other impacts that I'm not looking at all. The traffic is the primary one.
Following up on that, Mr. Bomer, would you say, summarizing your opinion regarding the parking structure that the building will be sitting on, is it your view, and I understand you're not a traffic engineer, is it your view that this site should have less parking on it and less of a parking structure? Or is it?
It is. I think that, I mean, there are a lot of variables, but as I said, I think I can't imagine how to park any more cars on this site. And certainly if you believe that the fire department is going to make you drive all the way around the building as well, it uses up most of the site. So yeah, in my opinion, it would be tough. And I think what I struggled with, mainly related to the scale of the plinth and the building on top, was actually believing, as I said, that this is one development where I think it would actually be better if you held everything else constant. I think it would be better if the kind of oversized lawn area on top of the plinth were cut down and have more at-grade usable outdoor space, which would probably lead to cutting down on surface parking. But this is one development where I actually think a well-landscaped surface parking lot would work better than what's proposed.
Thank you, Mr. Bomer. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. I see there's a number of hands up in the audience, so I'll back away. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, I have one follow-up to that line, if I may.
Is this a question or is this
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Bomer, I observed your testimony on Blue Hill Avenue, and you indicated that you had seen a 3D set of renderings prepared by the planning board that included this site. Did you review that 3D modeling for your testimony?
Not of this site. I did not review anything that the town did on this site. I certainly did for the Blue Hill Avenue. Yeah.
You know that the Blue Hill Avenue, that materials that were presented for Blueville Avenue included 3D renderings of this site? Were you aware of that?
I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of it. I was just looking at the other site, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's all.
Okay, Beverly, can we open it up to others?
Yes, Beth, Beth,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Janiga from 658 Canton Avenue. Thank you, Mr. Bomer, for your report, very thorough. I read the entire thing. I just had one comment, or a question, it is a question. And I apologize, I don't think I misunderstood you, but if I did, please correct me. The proposed project is massive. One of the comments I believe you made prior to accepting questions was that you weren't going to make a comment so much as to the height of the proposal, but just to the overall structure. And you very eloquently explained the overall structure. But I do want to talk about the height to support what Mr. Corcoran mentioned. I mean, I think you do have to comment on the height, just not the whole size of the proposal, because even if they decided to make one building that was, I don't know, I guess smaller, but the height stayed the same. You're talking about having an underground parking, and you said it's 12 feet to the first residential floor. That, what they have proposed right now, just even in the front of the building, is massive. The height, in my opinion, I'd like to hear your opinion, is massive, and it's the whole size of it. I concur. It's taking up the entire lot. But I think the height of that building, even from the front, no matter sides or the back, no matter where you look, I think is completely out of proportion to the surrounding neighborhoods. And so I think the height of it does have to be mentioned, because if they bring forward another proposal, but you still have, 4 stories on top of something else, and then on top of that, my understanding is if you, on the very roof of the building, they have to put, I guess, air conditioners and various other things, and that's going to be screened in with some kind of screening material. That also adds height to the building. So my question to you is, I mean, can we focus on the height as well, to Mr. Corcoran's point? I mean, I think the overall height of that building does not fit in with the neighborhood, and quite frankly, the town.
Yeah, and well, I don't disagree with anything you said about the existing context. It certainly is taller than anything that's nearby. That is absolutely for sure. And but I think I think in my review of 40B developments in particular, and just backing up a little bit about, we know that they're going to be out of scale. So that almost always happens, and for reasons that I think we probably all know about, constraints that are put on the developer, on the types of units that have to be incorporated into the project. So we know it's almost always going to be a pretty tough problem of how to take something that's bigger than the surrounding context. So the way I usually look at these is the massing of the development in the right place on the site? Like, if you find a site that is suitable for a 40B development, and you understand, or almost always take it for granted, that it's going to need to have more massing than anything around it, at the very least, if not height, you would look at the right place to put it. And on this site, do I think it's possible that you could have 5 stories at the least impactful part of this site? Perhaps. And I really mean perhaps. Right now, as you pointed out, and I said earlier, they're starting out with a large structure, then building on top of that. And I think I'd go back to that, asking for more information. I think the way that you can figure out height, appropriate heights, is would be to have an accurate representation of the site, the proposed structure, and the existing context. Because then you could go right to your bedroom window and look up at the building and see exactly what you'd see. And so I guess I can't 100% rule out that it's possible to have a 5-story building, but I think at the stage of development it's at right now, it's hard to imagine, just because there's no space to work with. You know, taller things certainly work better if they're further away, if you have more foreground to work with. But, you know, that for typically to plant other trees, generally trees. But this project starts with a couple of really big issues in that respect. As I said, it's 16 feet of elevation before you even get to the level of the parking garage. And then it's 12 feet before you get to the deck. And then you're building 5 stories on top of that. So it's tough. It's a really tough problem. I don't think they tried to solve it. In what we're looking at now, it's kind of hard for me to get beyond just the scale of the plinth that the building sits in, not to mention the scale of the building itself.
Thank you very much.
We have Sean Fahey next.
Good evening, Mr. Fahey. Welcome.
Hello.
Muted.
There he
Hello.
is.
Am I okay now?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair. Good evening, members of the board. I have a few questions, and if I be allowed, I'd like to ask them. 3 relate to constructability, Mr. Chair, and the other questions relate to architectural building design questions. My first question is really along the lines of where Mr. Bomer has been. The building's 350 feet long, 200 feet wide, and 57 feet high. And that height is at the southwest corner. And it's shown on the plan nestled into an area amongst 6 homes. And the plan I'm referring to is the architectural plan A010. The homes range in distance, as I see on the plan, from the building. One home is 106 feet from the building. One home is 128 feet. One home's 150 feet. Another home's 190 feet. One home is 192 feet, and one home is 201 feet. The home that's 106 feet from the building happens to be the home that is nearest to the corner that's 57 feet high. I fully understand Mr. Bomer's perspective. The building seems to be so far out of scale for what's appropriate. So just to put into perspective, 106 feet for most of us is about 35 strides, you know, a stride being about 3 feet. So for that resident that's 106 feet away to have a building that's 57 feet in height, 35 strides from their home, to me is just overwhelming. So I guess my question is this type of a building, this size, this height, and that close, nestled in amongst those 6 homes that are as close as what I said, is this consistent with what is expected of a development fitting into a developed area? And I probably don't need an answer to the question, but Mr. Bomer's point of view, I think, has expressed that in his opinion, it doesn't. But if the applicant chooses to answer the question, I'd appreciate that answer.
Mr. Bomer, do you have any comments on that question? And I think you're right. I think it's more of a commentary than a question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would use the words nestled in among other buildings. It's really not. That is now the grades work. It's actually well above most of the buildings. So yeah, I mean, I think my report is pretty consistent about noting the incongruity of the structure. I do want to point out, I did misstate on top of the parking deck. I think the tallest the building gets is 4 stories, not 5 stories. On top of the deck, there would be mechanical equipment, but the tallest part of the building is 4 stories on top of the parking deck.
Am I still, Mr. Chair, am I still on?
Yes, you are.
I didn't say nestled in a complimentary way at all. My inference is that it doesn't really fit in to where it's placed on the site. I have a couple of other questions that I'd like to ask. The architectural site plan A010 indicate trees that appear to remain that are located above drainage retention systems. And those are the drainage retention systems that are alongside the drive coming in from Canton Ave. Is that an accurate representation? Will those trees actually remain?
In my opinion, no. And I think the civil engineering drawings haven't been coordinated with the architecturals, but you're absolutely correct. I'm looking at the same plan. You're right. There are trees drawn where there are structures.
Okay, the plan's not representing accurately what will happen.
Well, I think I think the way to understand that better is to look at the civil engineering plans, because they do show where those structures are proposed along the entry driveway.
Okay, so the drawings aren't yet coordinated.
Right.
Okay. The architectural plan shows only 2 stair towers. This is what's shown on the architectural floor plan, and there are no paths of egress shown to indicate that that is sufficient. Has the egress been reviewed and designed to meet the code requirements? It strikes me as fewer stair towers than would be needed for a building of this size.
Yeah, and typically, I think it's reasonable for the board to request a preliminary building code review. As I said at the beginning of my testimony, I didn't go into the building. I was looking at the bigger site-related issues, not looking at details like that. It certainly is something that is not egress has to work perfectly. There are no exceptions to that.
Yeah, and I appreciate your interest in not going into the details, but I guess I look at egress and life safety as something a little bit more than a detail.
Well, so do I, right? And that's not really the sense that I use the word, but.
Understood. Is there, I think it's recognized by all that this building is going to require a significant excavation. And I happen to live in the neighborhood. I'm a resident that lives on Old Farm Road. So it's called Indian Cliffs for a reason. There's a volume of ledge up in this neighborhood that is very well known to all of us that live there. And is there an anticipated volume of ledge that's calculated by the engineers? And have they determined whether they're going to remove it by blasting or by a mechanical equipment method? For a building, and the reason I asked the question, for a building of this size, with an excavation as large as this is, that is a significant operation.
Yeah, and I think there was another point of consistency between my report and the civil's report of asking for a construction management plan that would give details about exactly that, the range of construction period related issues that would have to be accommodated. But it's, I don't know. I don't think there was a geotechnical report included in the materials. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. But that's a very good point, and I think a construction management plan, given the size of the footprint compared to the size of the site, people really need to know how this thing could ever be built.
Well, with respect to constructability, and with respect to what you just mentioned, a construction management plan, it appears that a building of this size would have a significant amount of workers, and something as simple as parking for the construction tradesmen. And it wouldn't be unusual to have 100 men working on a project of that, but the thing takes up such a tremendous amount of the site that something as important as being able to park the tradesmen on the site doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, I haven't thought through it to that level. I think actually the civil engineer may have questioned exactly that of how to accommodate lay down space and worker parking, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, these are real issues that have to be handled, and at a point in time, determining that there is adequate space on site for parking or for construction equipment staging or material staging, it just doesn't appear to me that that's possible with this project. And my last question is with respect to positioning of crane. Again, the building occupies a tremendous amount of the site, and I don't see it possible that a builder could hoist, because there's no available area for a crane positioned on either side of the building or at the rear of the building. So the building length of 350 feet pretty much precludes the positioning of a crane at the front of the building to be sufficient. You just can't make that reach. I guess in summary, the building seems so large that the constructability of it, in my opinion, doesn't seem possible.
I think you know what I would just suggest, it's actually right on the first page of the of the Tetra Tech report. The very first bullet asks very similar questions about how the actual construction process would happen. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, those are all the questions I have for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fahey. Who do we have next?
Lara Roche.
Okay, Lara Roche, is that?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. My name is Lara Roach. I live at 44 Holmes Lane. Mr. Bomer, I was wondering, have you had the opportunity to take a look at the comps that were included in the developer's application? And if so, do you have any thoughts that you can share about that? It seems to me that the comps are actually not comparable at all. And for example, Winter Valley was included as a comp, and although it's a lovely community, it's 160 units spread over 21.5 acres. And comparably, the proposal that we're discussing here is inclusive of 124 units on just under 5 acres. So another comp, I think, also was Oak Row on VFW Parkway, and Home Depot is their main abutter, and that complex only has 80 apartments. So I guess anyhow, you mentioned a few times throughout your report that the proposal is unprecedented. So I'm curious whether you are saying that in respect to the quote unquote comps, or if there was something else, and I'm hoping that you can, share any thoughts there.
Well, I haven't looked at the comps, so it wasn't relative to that. I think what I mean by unprecedented, I think everyone knows, there's no question that it is of a scale that is certainly unlike immediate neighbors. So there is a scale issue that's unprecedented. I think for me, it's more the attitude towards the site, how the site is developed itself, that is unusual. I think it's and again, I know I've said this already, but I think it's an unusual approach to site a building with so little connection to grade, basically, to add grade amenities, to recognize the contours of the site, the existing significant tree growth, the extensive pedestrian network that is right down at the bottom of the driveway. There's a disconnect that is, I think, a really unusual approach for this site. So maybe unprecedented. I mean, again, there are some other large interventions that have happened over the years. A hospital is a big thing. and that's not very far from here. And the high school is a big thing. And the senior development to the northeast is big. But certainly the high school and the senior development found ways, I think, to do, they had much more significant sites to work with and found a way to fit in, I think, in a way that makes them work.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I guess I would say if you do have a chance to take a peek at the comps, you know, they were eye-opening to me in that they really are not comparable at all. And it was actually a bit insulting as a neighbor, as a direct abutter, to have comps that are not even the slightest bit comparable. So I would suggest if you do have a moment to take a peek at those comps. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Roach. Bev, next.
Who's next? Cheryl Tagayas.
Good evening. You're muted.
Sorry. Good evening. This is George Tagayas. I'm with Cheryl, but I'm going to ask the first question. We're at 660 Canton Avenue, also known as Mergewood Lane. Mr. Bomer, you mentioned appropriate starting points. What's your opinion about retaining the existing house, which could lead the applicant to developing a more residential scale development such as Winter Valley? So if you retain the existing house, maybe some two-story structures around it. You didn't mention the house at all in your report when it was up for sale. The realtor had on their website very lovely interior photos. It's a beautiful historic home. Perhaps you could comment on that.
No, I didn't. I mean, I just want to be careful about what my role is. So you know, I'm an architect. I develop lots of multifamily developments. And this isn't the proposal isn't an approach I would have considered. I can say that. I have seen the house. I did go to the site and looked at the house, and you're right, it is a lovely house. But do I think it's possible? Yeah, I do. I think it's, you know, assuming that everything lines up, you know, development deals are complicated and the numbers have to work and whatever else. But I think that, you know, when I think about that house, I think more about the way that the development, the elderly development, the nearby development, their attitude was actually a kind of aggregating of smaller structures that were spread out around the site. But that was a much, much bigger site. So not really knowing what has to work to kind of make the fundamentals of the economics work, I really don't know if that's a legitimate scheme or not. But that scale certainly works for sure. It does.
Mr. Chair, while I have the mic, may I pass it to Cheryl?
Yes, of course.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and Mr. Bomer. Mr. Bomer, George and I are both architects. We've been practicing in the Boston area for over 30 years. And when we first saw this initial proposal, we too were surprised at the lack of incongruity, if you will, of this proposal with the surroundings. And some of those surroundings include 30 Holmes Lane, which is a home that was constructed in 1767 when there was some 40 acres around it. And you know, that property obviously has been subdivided over time and new homes built. And those new homes have fit in with that context of Holmes Lane, which was developed over from 1767 to 1927. And then the historic home on this 648 Canton Ave property built in the 1800s. And I just am curious, I know that you yourself do a lot of these peer reviews on comprehensive permits, and you yourself do, I think your firm does a lot of housing work And if you would just give us some context for your comments when you talk about unprecedented. I know one of the other speakers asked about that, but I'm thinking in terms of an architect and what you see and how you see our other architects look at their sites for these comprehensive permits. They are challenging because they're different than what's around it. But you mentioned that there would be better ways to do this. And you talk about the plinth quite a bit, but are there other things too? Is this a footprint of a building even outside of the plinth is really quite large, more institutional in scale. Whereas Winter Valley breaks up the residential units into multiple buildings. And I'm wondering if you could kind of comment about that kind of approach as an approach that might be more suitable for this site.
Well, again, the advantage when I'm the architect and when I'm designing it, and you know this too, the advantage of being the architect and working with your client is you understand the constraints better. You've got a deeper understanding of the requirements, and so which I don't have with this. So I would say, I think I just have to go back to what I said, is that 40B developments they're very challenging because of again, almost always working with larger scale within existing neighborhoods. Those are the really tough ones. So I do think a multi-building scheme would probably work better. It's certainly something I would look at, but I have absolutely no understanding of the economic constraints or and you see, I guess because you're right, I do a lot of 40B developments, and there are no two that are the same for sure. I think for me, the unprecedented part about this one, I think, is more, and it's not the only one I've seen that does this for sure, but I do think it's the typology. It seems to be driven by the notion of building a parking garage. I think that's really what it is. That's the main driver of this design, was to build this big parking garage. And I think I said in my report that I can imagine a site where this kind of idea would work, but it would have a lot more space around it, and it wouldn't have important little historic homes within 160 feet of it. It wouldn't be this site. So I'm not trying to avoid your question at all. It's just I'm not the designer of it, but and like most architects, I'm a better critic than a designer probably. But on this project, and I think something you said that I think is, and I didn't mention this in any way in this report, is the historic context. And I didn't do that level of analysis at looking at those homes and try to understand the history of the smaller homes on Holmes Lane or the existing building where this site is. I think my report is really, really focused on just this scale and typology in this location. I think I didn't get much beyond that, frankly.
And I do hope that you have opportunity to continue to review modifications to this proposal. And when you do, I think one thing to bear in mind is the current site plan locates a transformer at the portion of the property which is closest to that 30 Holmes Lane house built in 1767. Yeah. And also the main parking entrance, every headlight will head right towards the front door of that same home. So this architect, I think, if redesigning this site, would be advised to be considerate of those impacts that would be on that particular property, as well as the other homes on Holmes Lane and direct abutters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kristen? May I?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Kristen?
Good evening. Hi, I'm Kristen Repa, living at 654 Canton Avenue, also known as Mergewood Lane. Mr. Bowmer, thank you for your report and your consideration of this property. I just have a few questions. The first is to address your suggestion for less parking. My first question is in your professional opinion, are you suggesting less parking but maintaining the same number of units? So meaning
No,
Okay.
no, I'm not. I think while I'm not an expert at parking at all, I'm not even questioning the 1.5 ratio in particular, even though I'm much more urban oriented, so I'm used to much lower parking ratios. But no, I'm not. I don't think the path to fixing this is by maintaining unit count and eliminating parking spaces. I think I said that in the very last, I think it was in the last paragraph of my report, but I think they both need to be modified, unit count and number of parking spaces.
Thank you, sir. Also, then do you have an opinion as to how many units are appropriate for this size lot in this location?
I know I would study that carefully if I were the architect. Keeping in mind some of the concepts I was talking about earlier about intensity of use. So I don't know. I haven't done sketches myself to see what I think the site supports. But frankly, I don't start projects myself without having a really good sense of context, and a project of this scale, I think, really needs to do that modeling. I was talking about the 3D modeling. There's no quicker way to understand what the site can support than by actually looking at it in 3 dimensions.
I agree. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And as a side note, I am certainly no one that is involved in construction for a living. I feel as I'm just an abutter. And my layperson opinions are just that. I thank you for what you're saying. What elements would you be looking for? You had mentioned a couple of times that you were looking for maybe more free space. I'm sorry if I've
No, that's right.
called it, but what elements would you be looking for? Because I know that you have mentioned in your report that the lawn space was not really significant. So what kinds of things would you like to see?
Well, I do think having more active, usable outdoor space is important. And it would probably be for smaller children, probably. The high school is close by. So I do think having usable outdoor space is important, and it's part of that. Usable outdoor space also provides an opportunity for getting some distance from the other nearby buildings and integrating landscaping into the plan that helps the building certainly over time fit in well. I think the way that I would start to analyze the site to see what would work is finding where on the site is appropriate to put the kind of massing that I think I need in order to make the site work, as a successful, sustainable development. And part of that, the concentration of massing can go a long ways towards, in the right place, goes a long way towards leaving enough space that can be used, can be programmable outdoor space. I think the one other issue that I don't know if the fire department has commented on this, or may have been some comments from the fire department included in the planning department compilation of comments. I don't recall that, but the assumption, I think part of the problem is if you look at the amount of paving that's an impervious surface that's created just by that ring road that goes all the way around the building, and at the same time that there's this interior parking garage with generous, well-designed parking spaces, relatively efficiently laid out, and then outside of the parking garage, there's the width of what is normally a backup lane and double loaded parking that circles the whole building with only a small part of it with parking on it. And it just, the calculus isn't working for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not sure if this next part is going to be a question or just a statement, but again, forgive me for not being in the know enough, but I guess there's been plenty of other people commenting on the construction management and things like this, and I guess my question is, as Cheryl Tagayas mentioned, you have lots of experience in other 40B projects. My question is this a standard in regard to proposals for developments that we wouldn't know all of these things at this point? It just feels, I apologize the way that this sounds because I don't like to be that person. But it feels like it's a big waste of everybody's energy if we haven't done the work yet. And here we are, I'm a neighbor and sorry, but this is a huge distraction from my regular life. And if the developer has not done the homework and has not done the work, then what are we all doing this for if the work hasn't been put out in front of us yet? In your professional opinion, you've worked on other 40B projects. Should this stuff be done already at this point in the stage in the game?
Well, let me say that maybe this helps, or maybe it'll help me think of getting to your answer. I think in many suburban settings, the development of 40B projects is led by a civil engineer. So, and in many, not all, those are usually ones that are placed within wetlands and have they know they've got a pile of environmental issues, and they're going to be laughed out of the room if they're building buildings on top of wetlands. So there are lots of developments, typically in the suburbs, that have that. They're led by the civil engineer, and the civil engineer lays out buildable areas, suitable setbacks. The architect often will throw in rubber stamp buildings that they built somewhere else, and they see what happens. And then generally you'll see a lot more density than where it might end up. That's very gross generalization. I'll contrast it only to get back to this one. I'll contrast that with urban developments. Urban developments are usually working with greater site constraints. I mean, certainly wetlands are huge site constraints, but you might be doing an infill site. It's right between two other buildings, or it's a site where you've got all kinds of other architecture around you that give you cues of how to mitigate the scale. It's very different, but that's usually led by the architect. The urban sites are led by the architect. I think what's odd about this one is it has qualities of both, in a sense that I'm sensing that there's an architectural idea. They're both there, but there's a disconnect. There's an architectural idea about, hey, here's a building type. Let's build a big parking garage and then put a building on top of it. Yeah, that can work. It can even work on a sloped site because the back half of the garage will be semi-underground and the front will be entry level. Fine idea. then the civil engineer, and maybe this is more towards those unanswered questions, takes that and says, okay, I'll show you how you can do that. I'll show you how you can create that much impermeable area, deal with stormwater in a way that has never happened on this site because of the scale of this structure. And maybe we'll talk to the geotechnical too to figure out where the water table is, and then marry all of that. And I think what you're seeing in this development is a lot of discord in that marriage, because I don't think the civil engineer can work this out with the architect, not with the scale of the site, not with the, and certainly that says nothing about even trying to recognize the scale of the nearby buildings. So I'm not exactly sure if that's helping answer your question. You were talking about whether the work is done up front or not. In this case, I think with this proposed development, I'm not sure how to fix it. I think that's what I'm saying.
Sure.
I think it rather than trying to fix it and then present it, I think it needs to be unwound and reconceived.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do value your opinion on that. Again, my only purpose was to ask, again, I'm not familiar with what happens in these types of settings. This is my first experience with, being a direct abutter to something as huge as this. And I just know, as I said, in my own personal life, this is a big, it's a huge distraction and a huge expense for me to continue to come every Tuesday night and so on and so forth. And I just, if they have not done their homework, then it makes me feel even more bitter towards the situation. So forgive me for just being honest on that. My last question, I promise this is the last one. You have mentioned numerous times about the PILF and the height of the PILF. I would be, our house would be behind, but across from 648. So we are directly across from 652, which is not on the table right now, but a project that is somehow associated with. And if you are not familiar with that, I'm sorry. But regardless, my question is that with the impervious surfaces, the roofs and the ring driveway all being elevated so far beyond the, and this is what my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, elevated beyond the current level of the ground level. Is there any worry or consideration for the stormwater runoff, what will happen naturally when water comes from the sky and lands in places and then hits a hill and goes down, opposed to maybe running into storm drains and so on. So I guess that's my final question.
Well, and I'd recommend, I don't know if you've read the civil engineering report.
Thank you. Yes, I did.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, he talks a lot about that. And, my understanding, and I don't want to go too far afield, but yes, he's very concerned about it. I think he feels like there's no slack in the system. The stormwater management, I believe, largely relies on storage and then mitigating the flow of the stormwater into I think the town system, but it, as well as the concern about the water table and uplift on the building and all kinds of really important civil and structural issues. But certainly before this project should get approved, there would have to be, I would think, 100% confidence that what's being proposed for dealing with stormwater because of the huge increase in impervious area it's fundamental to any project of any scale. It has to be worked out properly.
Thank you. I do appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Tom Palmer?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you. My name is Tom Palmer. I was hired by the neighbors to walk the site during the recent public visit and look at the big trees on the site. I'm a botanist and a wetlands consultant. And I did review Mr. Bomer's letter. I like to refer to page 3 and item C, use and treatment of natural resources. In the second paragraph, Mr. Bomer, am I saying your name right?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, you're right. In addition, the report notes the presence of a number of valuable trees that will be impacted by the development. To the greatest degree possible, specimen trees should be cataloged. You're referring to the Tetra Tech report, I guess.
Well, and what I saw on the site myself.
You saw specimen trees. What do you mean by a specimen tree?
Well, I'm not a botanist, but what I meant is a tree that a mature tree that is worthy of preservation. I was particularly struck by, I think it was a huge beech tree on the site.
Yes, and you go on to say they should be cataloged. There is an existing conditions plan provided by the proponents. I think it was a DeSalle plan dated last June. Did you look at that plan?
I did. And I think what I'm talking about is more the, by cataloging, certainly knowing where they are, but understanding what might need to be done. I mean, certainly making every attempt to save them, but also understanding what kind of tree it has and, the extent of the root structure, what would have to be done to preserve it, even though it might lose a lot of water that it's getting in its current state. For me, a tree protection plan is pretty fundamental, assuming you're protecting some trees. I'm not convinced this proposal really saves many trees.
Yes, you do say on page 2, if I can quote you, given the large proposed footprint of the building as well as the installation of stormwater management structures outside of the footprint, there does not appear to be much opportunity for saving trees.
That's certainly my impression when I overlay the drawings.
Yes, I did submit a list of some of the trees I looked at and measured in a site walk, and that is now available on the town website if you like to consult.
Terrific.
Yeah, I would say that on the existing condition plans, you mentioned that it would be useful to identify trees. The trees are generally called either DT or CT, which I assume means deciduous or coniferous, but not identified beyond that. And I would agree with you that it is really hard to look at the existing conditions plan and match that with what you can see walking around the site in reference to the scale and age of the trees. So thank you for answering my questions. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Robin O'Neill?
Yes, my name's Robin O'Neill. I live at 30 Holmes Lane, the home that was mentioned before, the 1765 house. I have a couple questions about this. You bring up like the way the driveway is constructed right now, which would lead lights directly into my home. We have no setback from the lane. The lane was put there after my house was built. Are there any ways to accommodate that? And the transformer that also was suggested would be in basically my new front yard.
Well, I'm not the architect. And I'm looking at, so your house is the kind of L-shaped one that literally looks like it touches.
It's immediately on the lane.
Yeah.
Is there any revision to this model that would help? I mean, I know the other concern I have, and this is sort of goes to the same thing, is this week or last couple of weeks, we've had a gas main put up our lane. I have several backhoes, you name it, immediately across from my house. Is this what the construction site would look like for anything planned as this large of a scale? I mean, just to do it something for 2 weeks has been really crazy. You can't get in and out of our lane, and any use of our lane as an emergency or construction access would be, to me, an unfair burden to the neighborhood, and particularly to my home.
I don't know if you can answer that, Mr.
Yeah.
What I'm asking is there a way to mitigate this with this proposal? That's my question. I understand I made a statement, but I made the statement to propose the question.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Well, the one actual, I think it might have been the only design suggestion I made in my letter was removing that whole quadrant of the parking deck exactly in the corner that's closest to your house, so that the proximity is troubling for sure. And in my opinion, that would be really worth studying. I think the passive recreation space on top of the parking deck, in my opinion, is really out of proportion. For the scale of the building. It's very big. I forget how many thousands, like 35,000 square feet. It's in my report. It's many thousands of square feet of passive recreation space at the expense of having any ground level recreation space that in the case of your house could move it further away from your house, so, and create some more space, again, some more slack around the building to deal with issues exactly what you're talking about, some immediate small scale issues.
When you say slack, do you mean like setbacks?
Yeah.
Barriers or farther, something farther away?
Yeah, it's space that is available for whether it's to help with stormwater, landscape buffering, another place to put a transformer that's way further away from the current proposal. They're just having space to deal with all of the pieces that it takes to make a building of this scale work.
Just to answer your question more specifically and not redesigning the project, but certainly if we were to approve some version of this project, we would be imposing conditions. And I'm sure that one or more conditions would address the kinds of problems you've encountered on Holmes Lane in terms of leaving stuff in place and coming too close to houses and all of that. We certainly could address that by way of conditions. As it happened today, I just happened to be out for a walk and somehow I found myself on Holmes Lane. And I saw the backhoe and I know exactly what you're talking about, how close it was. I may have even seen you going into your house now that I look back on it. But this is a long process, as you know, and my expectation would be at some point we will probably get a revised set of plans proposal from the developer, which we will consider then in due course. And in the event that there was an approval of this project, there'll be, probably many, many conditions that we would impose on any approval that would address, many of the issues that all of you have raised throughout the course of the public hearing, and the issues of Holmes Lane would be certainly among those things that we would try to deal with by conditions. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm aware of the problem, and I think there's ways we could address it, both in terms of changes to the development plan and sort of more pedestrian measures to ensure that, they weren't parked in front of your house and whatnot.
Can I just follow up on something one of my, the other abutters said is, how long is this, all these details get worked out? Again, this is my first time dealing with anything close to this. We've been in our house 27 years and I've looked at someone's front yard across the lane from me. And now I'm, faced with this. And I understand that something is going to be built there. Things change. But my point is, how long do we have to wait for these details? It's a lot of stress on us.
All right.
Emotionally, financially, everything. And, you put your life savings into a home and the value could get crushed by something like this. And so I guess my idea is like, what is the timeline on something? Am I looking at years? Am I looking at months? Am I looking at weeks for details?
Well, I mean, the process, the 40B process requires us, without any extensions, to be finished with a decision by the end of June. So all of that proposals and consideration of new proposals and amendments and imposition of conditions, all that has to happen over the next 3 months without any kind of extension. And now what happens after that in terms of litigation or whatnot is sort of beyond my purview at the moment. But there's a timeline that we have to abide by. You have to reach a decision by, and we will.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's responsive. So it's a process that has an end date to it, at least as far as the Board of Appeals is concerned, in terms of issuing a decision, whatever reductions and conditions might evolve over the next 3 months.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question. Beverly, anyone?
Yeah, she's muted. I mean, she muted herself. I didn't. Ken Roche?
Good evening. Thank you. As Mr. Bowman and Mr. Reardon have touched on, there's zero slack in the design proposal. And even putting the permanent structure aside, constructability is definitely a real issue. In my opinion, there's 100% some sort of SOE is going to be required in order to allow for the safe excavation of foundation. Who knows what else is going to be come upon when you start to drive piles or whatever with ledge or whatever else is the unknown with the lack of soils, the soils and the soil testing, and also the test pits with ledge and everything else. When you combine that with trying to dewater the site with very shallow groundwater, which will definitely require a full dewatering system, which takes up a ton of space, and also an excavation that takes up 70% of the site, how will the site be built safely and with keeping impacts to a minimum to the neighbors? I know this probably is more on the civil side, but I think it's important talking about safety. And, I'm sure we'll hear from the fire department next week of how the fire department feels about the limited access. In Boston, I know the NFPA 241 is very strictly enforced, and 100% access is required around the site at all times. And I know all towns in Massachusetts and spreading outward is coming up to speed on the NFPA 241 and how important it is. And when you have a site that is this tight with limited access, when you put everything together with all the obstacles the site has to offer, I just don't know if it's safe. Or do you think it's safe to keep out the neighbors and everyone else safe while the building's being built?
Is that a question to, I don't know who's that directed to, that question? I certainly can't.
I guess it's the Mr. Bowmer at this point, but I understand it's probably more of a civil or question for next week, but it was on my mind after hearing the safety comments brought up by Mr. Fahey and, the zero slack in the building and knowing the distance from the building to property lines and what it takes to install SOE and what it takes to dewater a site during construction of this size with the groundwater, estimated at 2 feet below ground level. All that stuff takes up space. And I don't know if that's being thought about. And I know it's been requested multiple times for a CMP plan. So I guess it's just more of a question for, I don't know if it's anyone tonight, but maybe we can save it for next week. But I just don't see how it can be safely built at this size with the limited access and all the obstacles that are presented with this site.
I think all I would say is and you said it already, the construction management plan is critical.
Yeah, and we can, as you said, we can take some of these issues up next week with the town officials, including the fire department representative. Beverly, anyone else on the agenda?
Yes, there's one more, Wendco. I'm sorry.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Okay. Hello. Yes, we
This
can.
is Bob Kelly, 656 Canton Avenue. Can the
Okay.
architect outline what, if any, recommendations you made to mitigate the light issue that's going to happen? And can you comment on my assumption that you cannot mitigate the light problems from the apartments themselves because those are variable? And at 57 feet high, I would assume that my house is going to look like Logan Airport. Could you comment on that, please?
Mr. Bowman, you're muted.
I think I just want to start by saying that these plans are really minimal. So, I have, in my opinion, they're quite a long ways from having a suitable site plan. So to talk about light impact, I'm not there at this point. I mean, you are right about it's really hard to control light coming out of people's rooms versus, building mounted lighting or site lighting or pathway lighting. But I think until this thing gets resolved to a greater degree, it's very hard to talk about that level of detail. But I appreciate exactly what you're saying. I wouldn't know how to analyze it with given the level of completion of the documents.
Well, I would like to just state for the record that I assume that it's going to be a nuisance issue. And I guess we would have to respond accordingly as a private citizen with private property. But I don't see how there's any way they can mitigate the light disturbance from the individual apartments that are going to be projecting up 57 feet. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
We have Elizabeth.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Janeka from 658 Canton Avenue again. I just have to make a comment, and this is not a reflection on any single person on the attorneys here, the Board of Appeals, or a consultant. But to point out what some of the neighbors have commented, Kristen and Bob Kelly specifically, to say that they have not put forth a suitable proposal. It's unfortunate, this is where we are, that we waste taxpayer money, we waste individual resident money, and we waste people's time. And I realize this is what happens with every proposal. If I had to guess, I don't realize, but if I had to guess, this is what happens with every proposal. They're unsuitable proposals, and we have to go through this process. And then they finally put something forth that the town will approve and the residents can deal with. But we have experts here now saying these are essentially unsuitable proposals. And yet we are all having to go through this, including those of you on the zoning board of appeals. spending your time doing this. It's shameful. And this is the rules set by the state. This is nobody's fault here. But for the record, I want you to know that I find this shameful. This is a disgrace that we have to go through this process to listen to unsuitable proposals. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Denny Swenson.
Hi, Chair Hurley. It's Denny Swenson. Thank you, Chair and zoning board members for coming out. Another late night for you. Mr. Bomer, I noticed that you said the building was not designed with the site in mind. You pointed out that there's no space to work with. There's no room to mask the height, even with the trees. There's no room to keep 70 to 80% of the trees. And then there's no way to mask or buffer the height down the road because there's no room to plant new trees. There's no access for a stroller from development onto Canton Avenue. And you had mentioned that some developments can, and I'm not quoting you, but you said heal when landscape plans take effect down the road. But you said, and I think I'm quoting, time can't heal this. I was wondering if you had time to look through the sustainable development principles that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts includes in the 40B development application process.
I have, yeah. I've looked at those for many, many developments.
So you're familiar with them.
Yeah.
I noted that at the top of the sustainability principles, it says the Commonwealth shall seek to advance these principles in partnership with regional and municipal governments. I wanted to refer to the first one. Number one, concentrate development, mix, and uses. Encourage remediation and reuse of existing sites, structures, and infrastructure rather than new construction in undeveloped areas. And it notes create pedestrian-friendly districts and neighborhoods. And then
No.
Let's go.
Stop it in case we're not muted. Stop it and get upstairs.
We all have these family moments. So number 4, protect land and ecosystems. Protect and restore environmentally sensitive lands, natural resources, wetlands, water resources, cultural and historic landscapes. Increase the quantity, quality, and accessibility of open space and recreational opportunities. Was that one of the things that you were thinking about in the earlier portion of your report to us tonight?
I was on mute. Certainly not directly, but it's pretty fundamental to the state's guidelines are pretty fundamental to, you know, my own theories about how design should proceed. So, but I wasn't using that as a format for my report. No.
Thank you for that familiarity. You had mentioned earlier that you thought there should be a building code review. Is it your advice that we should request a building code review?
It's very typical. Yeah. So the you know, design is a recognized you know, extremely important factor in reviewing 40B developments, and of course having buildings that actually meet the state building code are a critical feasibility point. So virtually all architects do code reviews before they really launch into the design of their buildings. And at this stage of development, because it is so schematic, one would not expect an in-depth building code analysis, but certainly the basics about access to the building. An earlier caller mentioned the length of travel for egress, number of stairways. Those are pretty fundamental that should be figured out early on in a process. So I think it is appropriate for the board to ask for a preliminary building code analysis because of that.
I also noted that you pointed out that you were uncomfortable with the word nestled because you stated that this development would be above the grading, and it was compared to our high school, hospital, and some of our senior development. And I just wanted to note that in Milton and in a lot of other towns I've noticed, but in Milton especially, our high school, our hospital, and our senior developments, they all do have open space around them, a significant amount of open space, and they almost always have a healthy tree and plant and vegetative buffer around them. And that seems to work when you're doing something of that scale. That open space is critical. I think that's something that you mentioned as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your evaluation, and I thought your report was very helpful, and I appreciate being invited onto the calls, Chair Hurley. Thank you for your time.
Very welcome.
There
Beverly,
are no other hands.
I'm sorry?
There are no other hands up.
Okay, well, it's almost 9 o'clock, which is probably a good time to stop in any event. So I want to thank everybody for their participation tonight. Mr. Bomer, you were very helpful to the board. Appreciate your thoughts. So just to look forward, I think next week we're going to hear from various representatives of the town with respect to their sort of take on this development proposal and development plan. And as I said, I think I've said in the past, when we get through the town presentation portion of the public hearing, the idea then is to have neighbors present so their case, although they certainly have done a good job of presenting it so far, as well as Mr. Corcoran. And I think the plan is that when we finish that process, that we'll kind of take a breath and turn to the developer and the developers representatives and say, okay, you've heard what you've heard. What do you propose to do? I think that's the way the process will unfold going forward, and I suspect we'll get at some point a more detailed plan plans that we received so far. So I think it was a great evening. Yes,
Mr. Hurley, could I just be heard on that specific issue? And I think my clients have raised some very significant issues.
Which issue is that?
The issue of where do we go from here?
Well, we're going to go through the public hearing process.
I understand that, but it seems to me we've spent 4 nights and we've just heard from 2 sets of experts that have said that this development is completely undoable for a whole host of reasons. Why waste 2 more weeks of your time and my client's money piling on when maybe it's time to stop and ask the developer to pause and come back to us with a plan that can fit and can respond to the stormwater requirements of at the state level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me it's time to stop, pause, ask the developer to get real about what it's trying to do here, instead of follow a cynical process through to death. Thank you.
Sean, do you have any thoughts on that suggestion?
Mr. Chair, respectfully, to Mr. Corcoran, the developer would value the input of the town departments heads and the fire chief and the town planner. So I propose that we proceed as you have outlined the hearing process.
Well, we can certainly, I think we should go forward with the town. We've had that on the schedule for a while. So I think we should have the hearing next week, and maybe we can revisit this subject after you've heard from the town representatives. But I think we should go forward as planned with the town representatives next week. But Mr. Corcoran, I'm not unmindful of your point. There seem to be some serious issues with this proposal, and but let's wait and see what the town folks have to say, and then we can take a breath at the end of the hearing next week and decide where to go next.
Thank you.
Okay, I thank you all for your attendance and your thoughts, and look forward to picking this up next week. And by the way, don't feel badly about us. We all just enjoy this. This is great. What else would we do on a Wednesday night? So this is good stuff. So anyway, thanks again, and I look forward to hearing from you all next week.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. So long.